And I now want to recognize our ranking member, Raja Krishnamoorthi, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This picture right here is one of a group of judges in the People's Republic of China. In China, the law is a tool of the party, not the people. In contrast, America sees the law as a tool to resolve differences between parties, where openness and fairness prevail. The Chinese Communist Party, known as the CCP, is taking advantage of the fairness of our system to undermine our security and bolster theirs. I'd like to focus on 3 ways this is happening. First, the CCP and its affiliated entities are using American courts and courts in like-minded democracies to silence critics and fight its opponents. Mr. Scott Paul, the head of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, who has testified before our committee twice, recently made truthful statements about BYD, a Chinese car maker. He said that it was controlled by the CCP, and in return, BYD sued him. He was forced to spend years fighting in court. Believe it or not, because of this litigation, his insurance policy was even canceled because, quote unquote, criticizing the Chinese government, as this graphic shows. In the email it says, criticizing the Chinese government may lead to allegations of defamation, which is not an acceptable exposure. This is the long arm of the CCP reaching into our jurisdiction. By having BYD sue Mr. Paul, they not only attempt to scare him from speaking out, but they are also trying to scare American companies from even doing business with him. The real cost of these lawsuits isn't just measured in dollars and cents, but also in the stories untold. The committee has spoken with multiple people who want to tell their stories but cannot because they signed NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, to settle frivolous CCP-backed threats. Because when you're in a lawsuit, it opens up discovery, allowing the CCP to get all sorts of sensitive documents about you. But when Americans try to get documents from CCP-affiliated entities, they can't, because PRC law often prohibits it. The CCP exploits the unfairness of this situation to its advantage. Second, CCP-backed litigants are also suing Americans in China and then trying to enforce those judgments in problematic ways elsewhere. This graphic right here is Mr. Li Rui's diary. Mr. Li was Chairman Mao's personal secretary, and Mr. Li wrote harshly about the Chinese Communist Party. His daughter gifted these particular diaries to Stanford University, but now the CCP wants to get these diaries back so it can rewrite history. So the CCP's proxy sued Stanford in Beijing, where, of course, unsurprisingly, the CCP won. Now it's trying to enforce that judgment in California. Stanford should be concerned because, after all, they have assets in China that the CCP could seize. But even worse is for companies that have employees in China. When an American company gets sued in China and loses, until the judgment is paid, the CCP can and does put exit bans on its executives, blocking them from leaving the country. For example, one American businessman has been stuck in China for over 6 years after a startup he invested in defaulted on its loans and the Chinese creditor sued him for millions of dollars he simply cannot pay. This brings me to my third and final point. CCP-affiliated entities can sue our companies, but we can't easily sue their companies, let alone their government. More specifically, it's nearly impossible to sue them in China, and very hard to even sue their companies here in the U.S. In fact, as you can see in this headline in the Washington Post, when Chinese citizens learn that CCP-backed companies that the U.S. has, sorry, that's the CCP calling. In fact, as you can see in this Washington Post headlines, when Chinese citizens learn that CCP-backed companies that the U.S. government has sanctioned can actually sue the American government in American courts, they're amazed. That's because suing the Chinese government in China is virtually impossible. And it's not much easier to go after Chinese companies either. Even in U.S. courts, some claim to be protected by sovereign immunity. and others use shell games to shield their assets and make our judgments unenforceable. Simply put, the decks have been stacked against us. And I don't think this is a coincidence. Xi Jinping has said the CCP must, quote, use the law to carry out its international struggles, close quote. The CCP views the law as a sword to use against its opponents and a shield to protect its interests. Thank you, and I yield back.